It's a great pleasure and honour to be here this evening, to be here at the launch night of the Mile End Institute. On this subject, I must declare an interest. I'm a union man to my last fibre. That doesn't mean trade unions, though I've nothing against trade unions. I mean the Union of the United Kingdom. I was born a Brit, and I don't want to die a ruck. Now, what is a ruck? A ruck is what the white papers in the run-up to the Scottish referendum depicted the remainder of the UK as, the remainder of the UK. Even if we are shrivelled and shorn of Scotland before I die, I shall die a Brit. Now, why is this? I think one must come clean about these things. Napoleon used to say, if you want to understand a man or woman, think of the world as it was when they were 20. But in my case, it's younger than that. It's the early post-war years, my first conscious years, when we lived in the shadow of the Second World War, a huge, great collective UK enterprise. And there were new state corporations, not that I was aware of them particularly initially, National Coal Board, National Health Service, the word national was everywhere. And one thought quite naturally as a Brit. Several times a week we went to the cinema, we children of the 50s, and we grew up to the sound of the Merlin engine, flown by Brits. Brits doing brave things with each other in the deserts, and people in the East End and elsewhere in the front line of the bombs. And we naturally thought as Brits. And so I will remain a Brit to my dying day. Constitutions, there's a number of problems with constitutions, particularly our one. Much of our constitution is still, as Walter Bagehot described it, a thing of magic and mystery. You touch it and it goes. You think you're tracing it and it disappears. All my life, as Carolyn said, I've been hunting the hidden wiring of the British Constitution. I don't want it to be written, actually, if I'm honest, because the lawyers would take over, and we historians would be much diminished. There'd be fewer jokes in it, because the British Constitution, in its own wonderful way, is the Ealing comedy that was never made. It's historic, and this is a particular problem, because that means there's always a time lag, because it's what the past hands down to us. It's what the military call a piece of legacy equipment. So it's bound to some degree not to fit where we are now. Its defenders, of whom I'm one very often, would say it is, however, more adaptable and flexible than many written constitutions, so that our time lag is in fact less than in other countries, and there's a lot in that. But constitutions are vital to countries, to state the obvious, because they're the rules of the game, and they all depend on a high level of sustained consent, which is especially tricky when we reach the more opaque elements, as we might on May the 8th this spring, if the electorate, when asked who rules, says not sure, and the parliamentary arithmetic is messily hung. And indeed, in discrete places in Whitehall and elsewhere, a bit of quiet wargaming is going on, of the Rubik's Cube of possibilities that we might face on May the 8th. It'll be an extraordinary day, if indeed it does turn out that way, because the party leaders are due at the cenotaph on the afternoon of Friday the 8th of May for a solemn act of remembrance of our deliverance from the war in Europe, the 70th anniversary of VE Day. And there they'll all be. They'll have to suspend their animated detestation of each other and their delusions of who's going to do what to whom and with what, at least for an afternoon. But that'll just add piquancy and poignancy to it. Now, even though, I don't want to go on too much tonight about this aspect, but even though we have now a cabinet manual, which is a great novelty for us, which talks about the tacit understandings of our historical constitution in hung parliament circumstances, we're still without complete maps. And we're not the sort of country that will ever draft, let alone enact, a formation of government act. So we could be facing very shortly a truly Bagehotian, mercurial, mysterious process of government formation, even more exciting and interesting to constitutional nerds like me than May 2010. Constitutions must feel fair to all parts of a country, and here the UK is in some difficulty and uncertainty because of the percussive effects of the Scottish referendum. The English question, English votes for English laws, roared into being at 7:06 on Friday, September the 18th, even before the final tally was in the Scottish referendum, when the Prime Minister came out and I think rather mistakenly pushed the English question instead of saying, what a terrific thing is, we're all together still as a family, I'll talk to my fellow Privy Councillor party leaders and we'll see what we can come up with. Didn't do that. It became partisan and political straight away. And This will become truly inflamed, the English question, if a Labour SNP deal of any kind comes out of the post-May the 8th negotiations, if indeed we get to that position. What to do with the wider question, or the narrower wider question as it is, of decentralisation and devolution within England? Are we moving to a mix of city-states? We've got one in London already, another one in Manchester is in the process of being constructed. Will we go back to the only local government formation we've ever loved, the counties, the medieval solution? We love counties because of the cricket and the cathedrals. Never warmed to anything else. Maybe super counties are the answer, with some ancient English names, which is what was the 1974 solution, which of course didn't hold either, where we have clusters of counties. And Nora, I'm sure, will talk in a moment about the importance of what she calls Devo coherence, absolutely critical to any new settlement working. But we need this evening to think of possible future events that could trigger still more percussive consequences for the UK. I'm a natural optimist, but I do carry one semi-nightmare scenario in my head, and it's this. 2017, or thereabouts, by the end of the decade, we squeak out of Europe. My great friend David won't worry about that, but I will. The Scottish question will then reopen, because Scotland almost certainly will vote to stay in. And Scotland will very likely have an SNP majority government after the 2016 elections to Holyrood. And the government, the Scottish executive, will say, we need another Edinburgh Agreement. The deal is off. We stayed with you in September 2014, largely for economic reasons. Now, the entire rubric of that is different. No longer automatic access to the single market and all that. So in 2022, the Scottish referendum of September that year, Scotland leaves. And in 10 years' time from now, we could be out of the EU, shorn of Scotland, narrow, shriveled, resentful, inward-looking in the cold northern seas. Not a happy picture. And if that does happen, it won't be because external threats or anxieties have caused us to do this to ourselves. It will be entirely internally generated. And it would be a grade 1 listed strategic change in our position in the world. And indeed, if you're romantic about the Union as I am, a very, very different country. We will come through it. That's where I am optimistic. Good things, and no doubt, will come out of it. But it will be a very, very different country in a very different position in 10 years from now if that happens. In a debate in Hogwarts, that's the House of Lords, about 18 months ago, Ian Lang, a former Secretary of State for Scotland and a very thoughtful man, said we need to find things to do together as a union once more. It's a very long time, he implied, since we did that. And it made me think. It made me think again back to my opening thoughts about post-war formation for my generation being very much a Brit thing. In the first weeks of 2015, naturally, political thinking and energy is almost entirely directed to the May general election. Elections are mood makers and mind concentrators by their very nature. And once the draft clauses of the future Scotland Bill and the Conservative proposals for English votes for English laws were published, the kingdom to come, as one might call it, has been afforded little or no attention by the politicians and the press. Have you noticed how quiet it's gone and all that? At least down here, not in Scotland. It remains, however, a first-order question of strategic proportions for the UK, as I was arguing a moment ago. Now, the great American commentator Walter Lippmann, as a young man, wrote a book in the 20s on public opinion, and he said public opinion essentially is the pictures individuals carry in their heads, maps in their minds. And I do wonder if the referendum comes back, a second referendum in Scotland in the early 2020s, if the younger generation that was too young to vote this time, or the younger generation coming through, and the older generation, my age group, which was very solidly unionist by comparison to the other generations, whether their maps in their minds will be the shape of the UK, which is powerfully etched into the template of my consciousness. Will it be different? I suspect it might well be. As I scribbled these paragraphs for a few opening thoughts this evening, I talked to an old friend of mine who's very close to the Scottish question for a long time. And I asked him what odds he would give on the union being intact in 20 years. And with no hesitation, he said 50-50. And then we went through the factors that bind the union. Ian Lang's question, what is it that we do together that still makes us a union? And this was the list we produced. It'd be quite interesting to hear your list, or on your way home if you want to think of your own list. The Queen, the Armed Forces, the Welfare State National Service, National Health Service, even though it's devolved to Scotland, it's still a binding factor. Economic stability, the BBC, the UK passport, and every 4 years, the Olympic Games, when for 6 weeks we think like a union again. Potent those factors are, we need more, considerably more, I think. The union is no longer a fixed map in the collective UK mind, no longer an automatic pilot guiding shared consciousness. I wish it were. I profoundly hope it can be once more.